All right, let's dive into a story that feels like it's pulled straight from a corporate thriller. But I promise you, this is a real Supreme Court case. It's got a huge loan, a company trying to play dumb, and it all comes down to a single sentence in a dusty old rule book that ended up costing them millions. You're going to want to hear this. So, let's start with the number that kicked this whole thing off. 16.5 million pesos. That is the amount of money at the heart of this legal war. A loan that would force the courts to ask a fundamental question. Who really has the power inside a company? The stakes were incredibly high.
And really, it all boils down to this one simple but very tricky question. Can a company be on the hook for a massive loan that its own board of directors never formally voted on or approved? That's the mystery we're about to solve.
Okay, so let's meet the cast of characters in this drama. First, you have the company, Cebu Mactan Member Center, let's just call them CMCI. Then there's its president and chairman, and Mr. Mitsumasa Sugimoto. And finally, the lender, Mr. Masahiro Tsukahara, who walked into this thinking he was making a totally normal loan to a company.
It all kicked off in February of 1994. CMMCI's president, Mr. Sugimoto, goes to Mr. Tsukahara and gets a loan for 6.5 million pesos. And to show this was a legit business deal, he didn't just offer a handshake, he came with company checks. So to back up this loan, Sugimoto issues 7 post-dated checks, all drawn right from CMCI's corporate bank account. This wasn't some casual IOU, you know. This was a properly structured deal, with payments all laid out for the next year and a half. But oh, it didn't stop there. Just 2 months later in April, Sugimoto goes back to Tsukahara for another round. And this time, he walks away with an even bigger loan, another 10 million pesos. That brings the grand total to that 16.5 million we were talking about.
And this right here was the lender's smoking gun. The promissory note for that second loan couldn't be clearer. It says, in black and white, Cebu Mactan Member Center Inc. promises to pay. Sugimoto didn't just sign his name, he signed it specifically as the president and chairman of the company.
So on the surface, this looks like 2 pretty straightforward corporate loans, right? Well, as you've probably guessed, this is exactly where the wheels start to come off the whole thing.
So the date for the first payment rolls around. Tsukahara takes the first check to the bank to cash it, and it bounces. He tries the second one. Same story. In the end, all 7 of those corporate checks were dishonored. The money just wasn't there.
You can imagine, after getting shut down again and again, Tsukahara was done playing games. He had no other choice. He sued. And he didn't just sue the president, he sued the company, CMCI, as well, for the full 16.5 million pesos. And with that, the battle was on.
And once they got to court, the story just split into 2 totally different versions of reality. You had the lender, Tsukahara, on one side, and on the other, you had the company, CMCI, desperately trying to put as much distance as possible between itself and its own president.
CMMCI's defense was pretty simple. They basically said, hey, that was Sugimoto's personal problem, not ours. The board never ever passed a resolution approving these loans. But Tsukahara fired back saying, hold on, the money was for your beach resort. And as far as I could tell, your president had all the authority he needed to make the deal.
Now, the lower courts actually sided with the lender, but CMCI wasn't giving up. They appealed, and they kept appealing all the way to the Supreme Court. The fate of millions of pesos now rested on a single piece of evidence that, funny enough, was hiding in plain sight the entire time.
And what was that crucial document? You won't believe it. It wasn't a secret contract or a surprise witness. It was CMCI's own corporate bylaws, the company's internal rulebook, the very constitution they had written for themselves. And when the lawyers finally blew the dust off that document, there it was, in Article 3, plain as day. It said the president shall have the power to borrow money for the company, execute contracts, and sign checks and promissory notes. I mean, it was all right there. He was explicitly allowed to do everything he did. It was the ultimate own goal.
So now the Supreme Court has this bombshell piece of evidence, and they were ready to lay down the law, literally. Let's walk through exactly how they broke it all down.
First, the court started with the standard rule, Corporate Law 101. This is what CMCI was banking on. Generally speaking, the board of directors runs the show. An officer, even the president, can't just go off and bind the company to a massive contract without the board's official say-so.
But, and this is the huge but in this case, the court said yes, the board holds the power, but they can also give that power away, they can delegate it. And in this situation, CMCMI's own bylaws had already delegated the power to borrow money directly to the president. It was like a pre-approval. The permission was already there in writing, which meant a special board meeting just wasn't necessary.
And with that, the hammer came down. The Supreme Court ruled against the company. CMCI was legally on the hook for its president's actions and was ordered to pay back every single peso of that $16.5 million. Okay, so that's a wild story, right? But why should we care about this old case today? Because believe it or not, it packs some huge, timeless lessons for literally anyone involved in a business, whether you're a founder, an executive, or even just an investor.
So what's the bottom line here? First, a company's bylaws aren't just suggestions. They are ironclad, legally binding rules. And those rules can give an officer incredible power, way beyond what you might think. The court essentially told CMCI, you can't just ignore your own rules when they become inconvenient. And just as important, outsiders like lenders are allowed to trust what's written in those rules. The big lesson? You have to know what's in your company's constitution, because you can be sure the courts will hold you to it.
Which leaves us with one final, kind of chilling thought. For this company, a few sentences they probably wrote years ago and forgot about ended up sealing their fate and costing them millions. It really makes you stop and think, if a company's own rules can be its downfall, what's written in yours?